Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two stories that took place in the mountains that demonstrate how crucial it can be to stay on the trail. Unfortunately, for the people in these stories, they didn't, and the results were horrifying. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On April 8, 2017, high above an area known as Lions Bay in British Columbia, Canada, a man named Eric took a seat. He was in the last stretch of a snowy climb up Mount Harvey with 5 other members of a weekend hiking group, and he needed a minute to catch his breath. The last kilometer of the trek to Mount Harvey summit is notoriously difficult and is both steep and above the tree line, leaving hikers exposed to the often tumultuous weather conditions found at those elevations. The actual summit itself sits at 5,420 feet or 1,650 meters above sea level and offers some of the best views of any of the mountains in the North Shore range. It's also just shy of the tallest in the area, giving a full 360-degree view in every direction. Up to the summit, though, is considered one of the most difficult day hikes in the range. There are several paths up and around the mountain, but generally it's about 8 miles or 12.5 kilometers of switchbacks and beside sheer drop-offs. That's also provided it's done in the best weather from late May to the middle of October. And while the group was climbing in April, which is technically spring, the mountain is high enough that it can look a lot more like the middle of winter at the top. This can completely change the equipment you need and the dangers you have to look out for. It also means that in bad weather, you could find yourself in snowstorm whiteouts with zero visibility beside 1,000-foot drops. Thankfully, these 6 hikers were a group composed of 2 different hiking clubs and have been completing similar climbs for much of their lives. Almost every weekend, each person was on one trail or another in and around the Vancouver area. When he decided he needed to take a breather, Eric called out to the others and urged them to carry on without him. He told them that after he rested a bit, he would catch up with them at the summit. The other 5 agreed, and satisfied that Eric would be fine on his own, they turned and continued toward the top. The summit of Mount Harvey is also unique and makes the mountain easily identifiable. The north face of the mountain is pretty much a sheer cliff that drops almost 2,000 feet or 600 meters straight down. From the ground looking up or from the summit looking down, the views are breathtaking, but as Eric was finding out, so was the climb at that elevation. While he was resting, a solo hiker trudged up the steep trail toward Eric, and the two exchanged greetings before the hiker asked if he was okay. Eric assured him that he was fine and mentioned that the rest of his group was probably at the summit by then. The hiker then said goodbye and continued on the same direction, and when Eric felt like he had recouped enough energy to make it the rest of the way, he resumed crisscrossing his way up. Then, as he rounded the last bit of mountain and the summit came into view, he was confused. The rest of his group was nowhere to be found. Instead, only the hiker was there, and as he got closer, he noticed that the man had a shocked look on his face as he stood next to a ledge. The other hiker then turned back toward Eric and apologized before informing him that all 5 of his friends had fallen off the summit. After a brief moment stunned and in disbelief, the 2 men checked their cell phones and found that they had no service to even call emergency services. Then, after standing there for some more time in shock, they had no other option but to turn back around and descend the mountain together until they got reception again. This wouldn't be all the way until they reached the parking area miles down the climb they just made. All the while with the knowledge that the rest of the group likely didn't survive however far they fell. Finally, just before 4 p.m. that afternoon, the call came into emergency services and search and rescue teams quickly responded and were on site within an hour. As it got underway though, Eric knew that a fall from the summit of Mount Harvey had only one possible outcome. But even still, he held on to the slim hope that the 5 other hikers somehow survived and were waiting to be rescued at the base of the mountain. More than 40 volunteers, along with search dogs and 2 helicopters, began looking around Mount Harvey for the fallen hikers, but the weather that day wasn't cooperating. Even when the 6 hikers were climbing, there was intermittent snow and visibility at times wasn't the greatest, so the effort was postponed to the next morning. Then, before noon the day after the fall, 4 of the hikers were found, and it was immediately clear that all of them were dead. Scattered around the bodies were their personal belongings like snowshoes and other hiking gear. It wouldn't be until the afternoon when searchers came across the body of the 5th and final hiker. Understandably, upon getting confirmation of the tragedy, the families were devastated and left with questions about what could have happened and why. However, a formal investigation into the cause was never executed, largely because what happened was clear to mountain experts. After the group of 5 decided to continue on as Eric rested, they reached the summit and began to explore around it. The on-again, off-again snow squalls caused varied visibility throughout the climb, but the snowfall had calmed enough to see the beautiful vistas all around. They then walked out onto a ledge to get a look at the drop on the mountain's north side. In that moment, the five had little to no idea about the danger they were in. This is because the group was standing on something known as a cornice. This is an overhang off a summit or cliff face made of ice and snow, and it can be impossible to tell if you're on one. Particularly prone to cornice formation are mountains with a steep side that is usually battered by a leeward or downward wind, like Mount Harvey. As snow and wind pelt the mountain, a false ledge starts to form and grow larger and longer. The longer a cornice becomes, the weaker it is, to the point where the edge can be dangerously unstable. Often, there isn't even anything below the cornice other than a complete drop-off. And even more dangerously, the problem is that when you're on a cornice, it looks no different than the solid ground it formed off of. You could be 30 feet away from solid ground and believe you're safe, when in reality, you're in extreme danger. In fact, in the days leading up to the accident, a popular hiking website published a report urging hikers planning on climbing Mount Harvey to be very careful of the cornice that had formed at the summit. To expert eyes, it looked like it was close to snapping off. Then, because of the time of the year, the terrain had grown even more dangerous as higher daytime temperatures caused snow to melt. This would then freeze into ice overnight, and the cycle would start up again in the next morning if temperatures were high enough. So by the time the group of five put all the weight onto the Mount Harvey summit cornice, its integrity would have been completely compromised. When it broke away, all five of them then free fell more than 1,600 feet or 500 meters. When they impacted the base of the mountain, it might be easy to assume that the deep snow below cushioned the fall, but the opposite was true. At the base below the cornice was snow and debris from an avalanche that occurred days earlier. So after falling for more than a quarter mile, the impact was no different than if there was bare ground or solid rock beneath them, which mangled and broke their bodies. Incredibly, another member of the hiking club was also supposed to be on the hike with the others, and he even had his bag packed and his lunch made. When he went to leave though, it was pouring rain and he was too tired to deal with climbing in those conditions, so he decided not to go, which likely saved his life. On July 24, 1989, two men were making their way down a trail from Mount Kurodake to Mount Asahidake during what they hoped would be a fun day of climbing. Mount Asahidake is the highest peak in the region as part of an active volcano group that rises more than 7,500 feet or 2,300 meters on the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. Interestingly, it mainly consists of rocks that are less than 18,000 years old because it's a stratovolcano which erupted fairly recently. This type of volcano is characterized by steep slopes and a cratered summit, and while eruptions have occurred there historically, it's considered to be mostly dormant these days. Getting to its summit can be done in two ways. The most common is via the Mount Asahidake Trail, which is a well-worn mile-and-a-half trail that leads from the base to the summit. The trail is remarkably straight, and the change in elevation along the way is 2,200 feet. This makes it a challenging hike, but not the most difficult in Japan. Then on the other side of the mountain is the Asahidake Kurodake Traverse, which is a stark contrast. From one end to the other measures around 16.5 miles, and the elevation gain is a staggering 6,800 feet. Those who take this route usually have to camp along the way, and it's so secluded that encountering a single other person on the trail is rare. The areas off trail, as you might expect, are wild and untouched, and it's also remarkably easy to get turned around, or worse, trapped once you're away from the trail. And in fact, of all the reasons visitors have required rescue services on or around the mountain, getting lost accounts for nearly half of the incidents. The two men in 1989 were making their way toward Mount Asahidake on the traverse when one of them suggested they go south in the direction of a nearby river. This, of course, would take the men well off the safety of the trail, and by night, a search was getting underway after they didn't arrive back home when they were expected. The Hokkaido police sent a rescue helicopter to look for them, and after hours of finding nothing, they expanded the search area. Then, when the pilot started making more extensive sweeps, he spotted something on the side of the mountain. Spelled out with lengths of massive birch trees were the letters SOS. The chopper then closed in, and the officers on board looked out their windows for any sign of the men. Once they flew about a mile or so north of the letters, someone spotted two moving black dots below, and it soon became apparent that these were the lost hikers they were looking for. The pilot then found a safe area and set the chopper down on the ground before officers and medics helped the two men aboard. Neither of them was in bad shape because they hadn't been lost that long, and other than being spooked, the men were perfectly healthy and relieved that they had managed to avoid being stuck in a much more serious situation. While checking their vital signs after the helicopter took off, one of the medics remarked to them how smart it was to build out the letters on the side of the mountain. None of the rescue team members expected there to be a long silence in response to the comment, but the two men looked at each other with puzzled expressions. The pilot then swung the chopper around in the direction of the letters, and when he got close to them, he hovered for a bit so that the rescued hikers could see what they built from the air. The silence was eventually broken by one of the men saying that they hadn't built the letters, even though, oddly enough, it was the letters that saved them. In fact, had they not been within sight of the chopper, it's unknown how long it would have taken to find them, if at all. But even more confusingly, if they didn't make the letters, who did? The only conclusion the police could come to was that there was someone else lost on the mountain who needed to be rescued. Unfortunately, it was too late in the day to conduct another search, but early the next morning, another full-on search and rescue effort began. The search team had no idea who they were looking for or how many people might be a part of the group that constructed the letters, so the effort covered the skies with a chopper while officials on the ground hiked their way to the letters to investigate the area around them. They ended up being about 2.5 miles from the summit and sat on a steep bank near a thick grove of sasa plants, which are a genus of bamboo that can grow as high as 6 feet tall. As searchers arrived at the letters, things began to get even more confusing. The view of them from the sky barely did justice to how large they were. Whoever made them used 19 birch trees, each section measuring about 16 feet long and very heavy. Then, a search of the area revealed something else. Human bone fragments were found nearby, and many of them appeared to have been gnawed on by animals. Also in the vicinity was a hole in the side of the mountain that was just big enough for a person to fit in. It may have already existed or may have been dug as a shelter by whoever made the letters, but at the bottom of that hole, police found several more interesting items. Below ground was a backpack that held 4 cassette tapes, a tape recorder, jewelry, a tripod, men's basketball shoes, 2 cameras, and a notebook. Also among those items was a human skull and a driver's license. The name on the license was Kenji Iwamura, who was a man in his late 20s. When police ran his name, they found that Kenji had gone missing during a solo hike on July 10, 1984, nearly 5 years earlier. He worked in an office in central Japan and was first reported missing after he failed to show up for work a week after he left for his hike. With the discovery of these bones, the tale of the letters was officially solved in the eyes of the police. At some point, when Kenji was lost, he must have built the letters, but no one saw him while he could still be saved. Police were certain that the remains found near the letters belonged to Kenji, but the bones had to be sent off for analysis anyway. Then, when medical examiners finally provided the report, though, the mystery of the letters only deepened. At the time, there was a limited amount of information that could realistically be determined during an examination, as DNA testing was still in its infancy. What they could tell, however, turned the case upside down. The medical examiner's report listed the bones as belonging to a woman between 20 and 40 years old. Kenji, on the other hand, was known to be alone, so investigators initially wondered if he could have crossed paths with another lost hiker at some point. It didn't take long to realize, however, that if all the bones belonged to one person and that person was a woman, there was no evidence that Kenji was even dead. It was possible that the woman could have found Kenji's wallet in the mountain and kept it with her belongings, but when cross-checking the list of people known to be lost in the mountain range, no one fit the description the medical examiners provided. So next, hoping to uncover any information that could help determine who the bones belonged to, police turned their focus to the cassette tapes found in the backpack. Investigators then sat in a room and played the tapes one by one in their entirety, and hours passed as they listened to song after song from popular anime movies and TV shows. Then, as one of the songs played, the music suddenly stopped and was replaced by 2 minutes and 17 seconds of what sounded like terrified pleas. One portion of this recording includes the voice describing the area where the letters were located and says the letters are near a deep sasa grove. What the person said was, quote, "SOS, help me, I can't move on the cliff, SOS, help me. The place is where I first met the helicopter. The sasa is deep and you can't go up. Lift me up from here," end quote. After listening to the message, police came to the conclusion that the voice was that of a man who they estimated to be in his 20s. The natural conclusion was that it was Kenji on the tape, but with the bones belonging to a woman, suddenly nothing made sense. And maybe even more importantly, what helicopter was the person talking about? With little else to go on, police decided to go back to the evidence they already collected and take a second look. One of the first things they needed to determine was how long the SOS letters had been on the mountain. The Japanese Forestry Agency and the Japanese Geological Authority were then brought in to assist because both periodically took aerial photos of the mountain range from maps. When they looked back through their past images of the mountain, they told police that the letters appeared on the mountain as of September 20th, 1987. This is 3 years after Kenji was lost, but it's not clear how frequently pictures of the area were taken. To confuse things even further, at one point in the investigation, medical examiners came back and revised their initial report. In this revision, they stated that the skull and bone fragments found at the site belonged to 3 people, 1 woman and 2 men. This was basically a step back in the investigation, so police decided that the bones should be given a full examination again, and on February 28, 1990, investigators went public with the findings. This second analysis determined that the bones belonged to only one person, and that was a male in his 20s. Police also learned from someone close to Kenji that he was known to travel with a recorder and tapes of anime song, and the basketball sneakers found in the hole near the letters were consistent with Kenji's known shoe size. In taking all their findings into consideration, police once again concluded that the bones and items found in the area of the letters belonged to Kenji. When this was announced, understandably, the public voiced their displeasure with the investigation. For one thing, Kenji's parents were played the recording, and despite listening to it over and over, they couldn't say for sure that the voice belonged to their son. The biggest hole in the conclusion of the case involved the letters themselves, though. A scientific study unrelated to the case was published on birch tree weight and density in 2015. In it, the average 8-foot length of birch is listed as weighing 108 pounds or almost 50 kilos. The 19 birch logs that made up the letters were double that size, putting their weight at around 216 pounds or 98 kilos each. Medical examiners determined during bone analysis that the remains indicated they were from a person who was thin and not very muscular. Had the person been further weakened by a lack of food and water for a long period of time, putting those letters together would have been nearly impossible to do on their own. Not to mention the fact that no axe or other sawing or cutting instrument was ever found at the site. Beyond just the weight of the trees, though, in the analysis, another troubling piece of information was found. Some of the bones were found to have been broken while the person was alive, which police believed was the result of a fall from a cliff just above the Sasso Grove. It was a survivable fall, but at the very least, this made it even more unlikely that someone with broken bones could have been responsible for the letters. The fall could explain why anyone was in that area in the first place, however. The spot where the letters were built was an easy place to get down by easing yourself down this steep slope where the Sasso Grove was. Climbing up and out of the area, however, was much more difficult and would have likely required gear and equipment that the average hiker wouldn't be carrying. In fact, in the days following the discovery of the letters and bones, a team from a local news outlet went to the site of the letters, which they reached without issue. When they were done filming, though, they discovered they couldn't climb their way back out, so they needed to be rescued. Police do acknowledge that it's possible that Kenji walked down past the grove, built the letters, then managed to climb back up the cliff only to fall off it, but that scenario is seen as highly unlikely. So, unfortunately, as unsatisfying as it is, that is where the case is today. Questions about the entire set of circumstances obviously still linger today, even though the case is considered closed. Like, for example, did Kenji really build letters? If he did, how? And if not, who did? And why were there so many discrepancies with the bones? Or why did the person on the recording mention another helicopter? It's all just very confusing, so I'm curious to hear what all of you think, and you can let me know down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. This is technically part 3 to the series Horrifying Mountain Stories, which, along with the mountain stories in general, have been highly requested. If you enjoyed it, let me know down in the comments, and I will try to make it a regular feature again. Also, if you have any stories that you think might fit the series, feel free to submit them to the form found in the description. Anyway, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.